The distributive property is how we get rid of parentheses, or at least it's how we get rid of the parentheses in one of the cases that we can see. Specifically, what I mean by that is when we have something that looks like this, where we have multiplication on the outside of the parentheses and addition on the inside of the parentheses. Just zooming in a little here. Addition or subtraction on the inside of the parentheses, really when there's multiple terms inside here. In order to get rid of the parentheses, then, well, if you look to see what the order that the operations are happening in the first case, we have to do the addition first, and then we do the multiplication. If we get rid of the parentheses, then we kind of default to doing the multiplication first, and then the addition. And so the distributive property gives us a method of replacing this original expression with something that's equal to it under all circumstances, but it has no parentheses. And we say that we distribute the A. So you can kind of envision this A is being distributed throughout the parentheses, and it's being distributed to each of the terms inside the parentheses. There's a B inside here, and there's a C inside here, so we get A times B and A times C. That's the end result here. So looking at a few examples, in this case, we have the pattern that I was just talking about. There's multiplication on the outside, and there's multiple terms on the inside of the parentheses. So that means I need to take this 2 and distribute it through the parentheses. First off, getting 2A, and then getting 2B, and I still have the two terms. You can see they're still added together. So I end up with 2A plus 2B, and that's how I get rid of those parentheses. In this one, it's a negative 2 on the outside of the parentheses, and it's being multiplied, and there's multiple terms on the inside. So I'll take that negative 2 and distribute it through. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. Negative 2 times y is negative 2y, and you can see I have the two terms still being added together there. In a case like this, where we have a negative, just a negative on the outside of the parentheses, well, this is really the same thing as saying negative 1 times x minus y. Well, this is sometimes pronounced the opposite of something, and the way we change something's sign, or take the opposite of it, is we multiply it by negative 1. So this thing right here is the same as multiplying by negative 1. We actually saw that same sort of we saw that same thing happening when we were talking about raising, when we saw how this sign and exponents interacted with each other. In any case, I'm getting distracted. So I need to take this negative 1 and distribute it through the parentheses. We get the opposite of x, because negative 1 times x is the opposite of x. And the opposite of, or negative 1 times y, which is minus the opposite of y, which really I could just rewrite that as the opposite of x plus y. So you can see that negative on the outside of the parentheses just has the effect of changing the sign of each of the terms on the inside. I had an x, now I have the opposite of x. I had minus y, and now I have plus y. This is the case of when we have the opposite of the parentheses, but that same sort of idea actually extends if we have 5 minus something. This may not look like the distributive property at first, because it doesn't look like there's any multiplication on the outside of the parentheses, but it turns out we can rewrite it so that there is multiplication on the outside of the parentheses. I would rewrite it like this, which is 5 plus the opposite of this stuff. We already saw the rules. We can rewrite subtraction as addition by doing this. And, well, the opposite of something is 1 times that stuff. So, kind of looking behind the scenes, what ends up happening is we distribute the negative 1 through the parentheses. Typically what we say in an instance like this is we're distributing the negative through the parentheses, and often people will show their work just like this, not doing this step, because it's a little confusing for some people. But I wanted to explain why we distribute a negative here when I said it needed to be multiplication on the outside of the parentheses first. In any case, we have 5. The opposite of 2a, or negative 2a rather, becomes a positive 2a, and b becomes the opposite of b. Or so you can see I initially wrote that as 5 plus 2a minus b. This is a habit that you get into when you start working with these positive and negative numbers, or changing addition to subtraction really is what it is. Going back and forth between addition and subtraction is such an easy thing. We kind of do it by default. And so 5 plus 2a minus b, or 5 plus 2a plus the opposite of b, those are the same thing. And it frankly doesn't really matter which way you'd write that. Alright, so we have the same sort of pattern happening here. We are subtracting the contents of the parentheses, which means I need to distribute the negative. So I'll get 2 that's the stuff out in front. And I'll get plus the opposite of x and the opposite of 2y. That's pretty straightforward. I should point out that in all of these instances, I cannot combine like terms. Well, there are no like terms to combine. If there were any terms that were like terms, I would want to combine them, but I specifically made these examples so that they wouldn't have any like terms, so we could focus just on the distributive property. Alright, so in this case we have, again, a minus stuff. I'm going to distribute my negative through the parentheses. We get a minus 2x plus y. And you can see I actually kind of took, you may be wondering why am I not writing plus a negative 2x minus a negative y. Well, like I said, when you see this stuff a little bit, this is ultimately where you'd want to go. But you may have done a plus the opposite of 2x minus the opposite of y, and then gone to this step. And that's perfectly fine if it took you 2 steps. This minus a negative y is really the only one that I would say we really want to get rid of. Minus the opposite of y should be rewritten as plus y. But between plus negative 2x or minus 2x, it doesn't matter which one of those you'd write as your final answer. Alright, so if you distribute a negative through the parentheses on these ones, if I say a minus stuff inside the parentheses, how about do we distribute a positive through the parentheses? And, well, the answer there is no. Yeah, that's basically the answer. When you have a pattern like this where it's just addition on the outside of the parentheses, we're not subtracting the contents of them, we're not multiplying them by anything, then this is actually not a distributive property type example. This is I'm doing this to kind of show you what happens, and really what happens is nothing. You're able to just drop the parentheses. This is using a different rule, a rule specifically of addition called the associative property. And the associative property looks like this: a plus b plus c is equal to a plus b plus c is equal to a plus b plus c. The only difference between these would be where you have parentheses. All 3 of these, if it's strictly addition between 3 numbers, you can put in or remove parentheses however you'd like. So in this instance, I have parentheses around the last 2 terms. I can remove those parentheses, and it's the same thing. Like I said, that's called the associative property of addition. And the same thing applies in this case. We have addition. Even though this looks like, this is subtraction on the inside of the parentheses, I can really think of that as being addition. But when I do that, this negative attaches itself to this 2b. And at this point now I can drop the parentheses. And, well, you can see this is just the same as 2 plus a minus 2b. So ultimately, you can kind of, it doesn't really matter what's going on the inside of the parentheses, whether it's addition or subtraction. What matters is whether it's addition or subtraction in front of the parentheses, as far as deciding if we need to use the distributive property or not. Alright, so let's look at a few examples, a few different ways that you can see with either multiplication or division, multiplication or addition, and how they interact with these parentheses, and so we can see what happens. If we have something like this, a plus b plus c, this is the example we just saw right up here. This is just a plus b plus c. There's no distributive property necessary here. This is the associative property. On a plus parentheses bc, this only has 1 term on the inside of the parentheses, and really, if you think about what the parentheses are doing, they're telling us to do this multiplication before we do the addition. And, well, we already do multiplication before the addition. So you can see we would get the same thing if we just drop the parentheses here, because it's just telling us to do the order we would already be doing. This one, a times b times c. This one is actually also, you can just drop the parentheses, ABC. This is another property, this is another associative property, except this is an associative property of multiplication that allows us to do that one, but it's very similar to the one with just addition. So the only case where we need to use distributive property is when we have the multiplication on the outside and the multiple terms on the inside. So this is the only case. This one right here is the distributive property, where we'd have to do AB plus AC. And again, I just want to point out, when we have subtraction in there, we have to use the distributive property as well, but that's because I am able to rewrite it, or in order, these same rules do not work with subtraction, these are only with addition. And so, yeah, I guess I could write some of these other ones. A minus b plus c, this one would also be considered necessary to use the distributive property, but we don't typically, I'm assuming when you're looking at a problem that you're converting everything to, thinking of everything as addition. Even if you write it as 2 plus a minus 2b, this minus you would think of as plus the negative. You would think of it in this way, even if you write it in this way, and so that when you're moving terms around, you have a negative 2b, or if you're talking about what that term is, it's a negative 2b.